Okay, we are going to begin looking at the text of Esther itself. We're going to briefly go into the setting that is established here in the early part of the book. There are some handouts that will show you what we are doing to maybe make sense of connecting all the work we did previously to show you what we're doing here in Esther to put this in greater context. So the first thing I want us to do is to look at the setting. That is, we need to understand the differences in kind of that world. Anytime you come into Scripture, but this is true in other contexts too, you have to enter their world to understand what was going on, what life was like, what the important things were, to appreciate then what is said. So many times, because we don't know the references, it doesn't strike us the same way as a similar thing would today. Someone, for example, tells you that they're going to D.C., you know exactly kind of the context of what that means. But someone in the Bible mentions about going to Susa or Shushan. You really don't know what that's talking about. You haven't been there, you haven't seen pictures of that most likely, and you don't know its significance. So we have to kind of set those things up and appreciate those distinctions. So the first thing is to just give you an idea of how Persia, the great empire of Persia, overlaps with biblical history. Persia itself lasted longer than this. The Achaemenid dynasty lasted for 200 years. It was a strong dynasty of what was going on here. So we start then in 559. We don't see them quite yet, but that was the first kind of figure of where they are coming on the scene, and this is where you have the Medes and the Persians, and they are gaining strength moving forward on this. And then you have Cyrus revolting against the Medes. So they were the Medes were stronger, Cyrus was in Persia, he revolts, and the Persians take the upper hand. Okay? That was the way in which their government and they worked. You then have this war going on, and then ultimately then we have, as through the process of war, Persia becomes strong, and in 539, Babylon falls. Now Babylon at that time held Judah. That was the end of their very short-lived kingdom. It was fast, it was powerful, and it pretty much was the length of the captivity. Okay, that they came on. They took over from Assyria. About 70 years later, they were overcome by Persia. So it kind of overlapped. And in that time then, Cyrus is in charge. And we find him in the Bible being the one who gives the decree and coming down from this. Now, when you go through after Cyrus, we're going to come down and find the name Cambyses, who reigns from 530 to 522. And for you to since Eddie had just went over in Ezra, what you have happening then with Cyrus, he gives the decree that allows them to go out a little bit after taking over. We're not sure of the exact date, but that ended the captivity and allowed them to go back under Zerubbabel. But then you read in Ezra that there were some problems that develop along the way, and they stop being able to build. And that continues the whole time under the reign of Cambyses. He dies in 22. There's a short kind of reign of a guy. There's a pretender to the crown. That's Pseudo-Smyrnus. But then 522, Darius, which is very important, he takes over. And that's when you have Haggai and Zechariah come on the scene saying, hey, it's time to get back to work on that temple. And that's what you then see pick up where they come back to finish the temple work. That was around 520 BC, and they complete that in 516. So that's what's going on during his reign. He reigns a long time. And this is the one who was in reign. This is important now. He's later in his time. He keeps expanding, pushing the borders, and mainly he's gone pretty much as far because they were over here against the mountains, and they're going west. So now, in 490, this is when you have the Battle of Marathon against Greece. Okay, that you hear about. That's under Darius. Now, if you remember what happens, because of that, these were really tough battles. They were well matched against one another. But Persia loses. And It's just a couple of years later. He dies in 486. Okay, so just a few years later, and that's when Xerxes comes on the throne, and that's the Ahasuerus of Esther. So you have him coming on the throne at 486. He's going to reign for about 20 years. And so when you come in and you have, it says the third year in Scripture, we know when that is. Once we've correctly identified, working through the linguistics of the name, that this is Xerxes, and it's the third year, we know the historical events that go on during his reign because of, you may have heard of him, Herodotus, who spends a lot of time talking about Xerxes. Okay? So we're going to be talking about those things throughout. And in 480, notice he is successful. You're going to have this battle going on later on with Athens, okay, but he's defeated at Salamis. And then Artaxerxes, we find late that he's the one that Ezra and Nehemiah work under, is Artaxerxes. So if you place Esther, it's actually in the middle of the timeline of Ezra. So you have to come through, and that it's going on. You've got the big part, the beginning of Ezra, and then you have this kind of, in chapter 4, this kind of overview, and then you have them, they're finishing up what they're doing in 5 and 6. But between all of that, when you have that going on, this is when Esther takes place, before you end up with Ezra coming back. So all those things are important to think about when we come to this book. All right, this is what you have in the Persian Empire. Well, that has a nice glow to it. So the Persian Empire, they are over. If you see Susa on the one of the far rights, Persepolis is actually another. That's a later, which is Persia City, right? That's what that means. It comes up. It's way over here. That's what they are. But they're moving all the way over. Okay, their furthest extent was in Macedonia. So that's how far they were able to go and control ultimately before they were then beaten back. They could not take Greece. And that ended up being their challenge throughout. This is an archaeological dig outside of Susa at one time. So now there's a lot of work. Don't think that this is just exactly how it looked, because they did a lot of things in the intervening years. But to kind of give you an idea of the landscape and the scope of what we have here. So when you turn over into the text and look at Esther, you immediately are going to find Ahasuerus, which is Xerxes, and I probably will just say Xerxes because it's easier. Vashti, we don't know exactly who she was. You would think that would be simple. Oh, this is the queen, right at the early portion. That should be easy. Persian idea of having a queen, y'all are thinking like Britain, right? It is not like that, okay? It's not even, if you think of Henry VIII version of Britain and the way he handled his queens, that's even simple compared to what they did in Persia, right? It's because you've got basically multiple wives, you've got a harem, and then you just have an elevation for particular purposes, okay? That makes it harder to identify. We think our best guess is that this was a mistress who was actually very powerful and continued to be behind the scenes even after this in different ways. The third year of the reign then would have been 483 BC when this first comes up. So we can place it specifically in that historical context. So now we're going to take a look and see this. I've titled this section, A Temperamental Ruler. And that is, you are introduced to the king. And what is most important in terms of setting as an overall story is we are going to learn about how he makes decisions, what matters to him, and what the situation is in the kingdom that goes on. And whenever you have, again, an overall storyline, the exposition, so we'll also be talking about the book as its overall storyline, okay? And then, so it's easy here, exposition's always first. So it's getting out all the information you need to know from the very beginning. And that's what we're going to see. So I outline it for this way, and we're going to get right to the text, but I can go ahead and give you the preview. That the first 9 verses of this chapter are all giving kind of important information and leading up to it. Now, a key element, so you can learn to I want you to kind of process this and see how this works, is rising action occurs essentially when you begin to have conflict. If you don't have conflict, then really it's still just telling you information. You're looking for where you have conflict, and then the conflict builds. That's rising action. So you don't really have conflict in this chapter until you end up with a request denied. Now we're kind of, we've got a problem because of the queen saying no. Okay, so that's what's going to go on, that goes all the way through verse 20. The reason why, usually your exposition isn't that long. This is the beginning of a book, so it's giving you information not just for this particular story, but for the whole book. That's one of the reasons it's longer. Usually rising action in any kind of account is the longest part of the story most of the time. Certainly that's true in movies, is they get you just enough information to know what's going on, and then we keep playing with you through the whole thing. A book, how's this going to be resolved? How's this going to be resolved? We resolve it, climax toward the end of the story, and then how are we going to handle everything to make you feel like it was a whole story? And that's fallen action and denouement. So it's expected you'd have a long period of this. So you get to the climax, you have one verse on the climax, and then the fallen action and denouement here I divide up the last verse. Okay? So now we want to read through this and see, here's who we have. There are 3 important figures in this account, the names we're going to see. The first is the king, who is the ruler type. Okay? He is a king. He certainly is out of touch in many ways. We're going to see. There's Vashti, who doesn't want to do what the king says, and that's a rebel. And then you have a man named Memucan, who is giving advice, okay, that the king takes. So that's your sage kind of in this, at least in where they're portraying him as the storyline. Those are your characters. So now let's take a look. We'll start by looking at the first 9 verses. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Now notice what information we just have. It's both identifying him historically, okay, so this is Xerxes, and to make sure, because Xerxes was a name that was used later on. Okay, so this is the one who was reigning when they had everything divided up into 127 provinces. So that was actually known to be an instance in which they deliberately had, it's both provinces and sub-provinces, so that it is an extensive kind of network, of an administrative network. That's what's being identified. So here's what was going on at this time, which means it's a unique time in history. Okay? So it would have been an interesting thing, someone familiar with it, to explain that. It was also from India to Ethiopia. Now, if you remember, that map showed you they went as far to the east as India, and then it's interesting they chose to go down south to declare it to Ethiopia. I think that likely would have been how they would have described it, because why would you not want to go further west? Because that's where you'd had the greatest problem. And you can't say to Greece. So most likely that was the case. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the citadel. That's also important. Now Shushan, you have to think about the Hebrew alphabet. You have the Sin Shin. And it's the same looking letter. It looks like a funny kind of W. If you see it, most Bibles now you'll go look at toward the end of Psalm 119, which we've been reading through, and then sometimes we'll have the little character there. Well, that's shin, but it can be sin because it's dependent upon where the dot is on the left or the right. And that wasn't even original. It depended on context originally, which if you are familiar with the story involving shibboleths, how you say something, Okay, that was part of this as well. But Shushan, which is, if you remember, that is because it's sh, but it's also s. It's Susa. So historically, we know this as not Shushan, but as Susa. It was a citadel, and it's a fortified city is what that means. That in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him. Now this is going to be something, because he says, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. That is, for 6 months, according to the text, he is feeding them. Now he says in all, the question is the next feast, so you have a feast, but the last feast is different than the first part of the feast. We're going to come back to that. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. That is a correct description of how in the palace they would have an opening, and this comes into play later in the story, about where the throne was, and there was a reception area, you had the court, and the court was kind of an open area before you have the gate, and that's going to come into play when you get to something that Mordecai is going to do, okay? That he has to stay outside that area, at least at first. Now look at verse 6. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars. And the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. Okay, it is lush, it's expensive, it is using the very best of the materials available today, which you would expect of the king who was over the empire that is the most powerful in the world at this time. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other. Now, you know, what's the difference there? Nothing's mass produced. Okay? They're not just running through. These are, every single one has a craftsman making in a different way. There's an artistic element to it. With royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. So everybody just have as much as you want. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory. Now, to understand this, what you would have as one of the customs was, you did not drink unless the king was drinking. Okay, everything was tied ultimately to the king taking a drink. That's when you drink, but you didn't have, the whole idea is they had broken that off, and that was not a requirement to do that in the same way. So there were no limitations, there were no requirements. That's the idea of not being compulsory. For so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. Y'all imagine if you had to wait around and sit there waiting to see? But that was authority, that's recognizing his authority, even in a social kind of context. Now notice verse 9. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace which belonged to King Ahasuerus. Okay, so when you look at what's going on here, you have a lot of important information laid out for us. Okay. The first thing is that we know the exact time. It's the 3rd year of the reign, and it's Xerxes. So you have a historical king, very well known because of Herodotus. You have the exact year. Now that's going to be important because we know what's going on at this time. It is found in Susa, that's tied to verse 2. Now, when we come to verse 3, of what's going on, you have the double feast. You have a 6-month feast, and you have a 1-week feast. And in that first feast, he has, notice who's here. It's for all his officials and servants. the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him. Okay? Who was at this feast for 6 months that he's brought in? The most important and wealthy people of the empire. These are where this is all the people that would have he has to influence throughout to pull in money, and also when you say about the nature of the powers, that's your military. Okay, so you have your political power people that serve in those capacities, governors and stuff, as well as your military people. And then you look at verse 4, though. I'm going to come back because he's showing off his wealth, which I point out later on. That's the tone, is he's showing off. Okay, so he's showing how much money they have. Wealth, being generous. He's got all of this going on. But it's at a feast, and then he comes down and he's got this feast lasting 7 days. What is the difference between the 6-month feast and the 7-day feast? Which the 7-day feast clearly is kind of the culmination. Okay, now this is just a celebration kind of feast, and the first one wasn't. So what was the first feast? If it wasn't just a party, what was going on? It's not obvious as you read the text, is it? Okay, that's where our timing becomes important. Because it just so happens this would seem to correspond historically with the time in which he is setting up for an invasion of Greece. Dad lost. Okay, Darius, remember? He loses. So we've now got, the sequel. We don't like having lost, so he's setting things up, we know, to go in and to now go back and take another army into Greece. Notice what he has done. He has brought in his great powers, right? All the important people. He's showing off that he's got wealth, he's got a plan, and he's in control. Someone's about to undermine all that. So you have to put the whole thing into context of what's actually happening, so that when you get to verse 5, and now we're having the party, we've got a plan together, everything's figured out what we're going to do, we've built up, everybody's ready, everyone's on board, we're going to celebrate this for a week. So we're just showing off what's happening. So let's look at verses 6 through 8 where what he's showing off. It's the palace. He's showing off basically what's around him, but it's also the nature of having, so it's what the environment is that he's showing them they've got the money to do this. Look how wealthy we have. This is not going to be a problem. And he's serving each one of them out of a different, individually different gold vessel. That's not something they would have done all the time. So they get to participate because of their relationship with the king in this kind of, I've got plenty. That's why it's not compulsory or waiting. You can have as much as you want. Everything is designed to convince the people there that this king is in control, wealthy, and that we can do whatever we want to do. That's how powerful we are. And the king is leading this forward. So that is the whole idea. Then in verse 9, you are introduced to that last figure. You've got the men. We're going to come up and he's going to have some more specific men in a moment. But now we get Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. Now, the way in which they worked these things, and we don't think about this too, but you describe how the relationship with the women worked, is that you had essentially, even in a palace, you had a huge whole side that was just essentially for the men, but you had a whole separate area that was for the women. Okay, now remember this, and this is just the king's women. Okay, they're all set up, but it also would be acting then in an official capacity. Whoever was the queen at that time would then be in charge of running that corresponding feast for all the wives of the men who have come. Her job then is to essentially wine and dine the wives the way he is doing their husbands, to make sure they're all happy and that they're not going to cause a problem for what the king's plan is. Okay? So that is all this information. We don't have a problem introduced yet, which is probably why they don't mention the purpose. It doesn't serve the story specifically. That's probably why they don't mention the exact reason why that meeting takes place for the purpose of Esther. Okay, so now we get to the rising action that occurs in verses 10 through 20. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass. I love that name, Carcass. 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. Then the king, so that's first stage, right? Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice, those closest to him being Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in the kingdom. Okay, next level. So he says then, verse 15, move through this. What shall we do to Queen Vashti according to law, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs? Now we get advice. So we've got a problem. We bring in other people. We get the question. Now we're going to hear what the response was. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus there will be excessive contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it shall not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. All right, so notice in the process of this, we have the problem presented, the refusal, so we've got conflict, but we don't have it resolved what's going to happen. What's the king going to do? That's not been done yet. We're right to that point. Say it again? Well, that's what the advice is, but he hasn't done it yet. See, that's why we haven't reached the conclusion. That's why all of this is rising action. Now, as we walk through this, here's how it lays out. You have, first of all, the command to bring her. Now, to understand what he has done in this is he's put all this, number one, you see he's merry with wine. That's an important part of this, okay? Merry with wine and served. You want to bring the queen out before the king. And it says, wearing her royal crown. Now, sometimes people, well, what's the real problem here? Well, There could be a number of problems with this. It's not as obvious, but it's emphasized. Number one, why is the royal crown being emphasized? And the purpose is to show her beauty to the people and the officials because of how pretty she was. Okay, she's beautiful to behold. It is possible that when he says wearing her royal crown, that's all he wanted on her. That's quite possible. Now, it doesn't have to be. She's got responsibilities that she would then have to stop what she was doing just to come out. The other thing that's interesting is it's possible, I'm going to only throw this out as a possibility because the history and the timing would have to be so precise, that Amestris was actually, if that's the one who this is, was pregnant at the time. So you've got a lot going on in this. The point is, though, as you go through, she would have a lot of reasons not to. I'm going to throw out one more reason why, though. We also know from Herodotus in earlier instances, now you have to put this, Herodotus was a Greek commenting on Persia, whom they were enemies, right? They fought multiple battles. But the indication was that there had been times before at events such as this that you bring out a woman and that's pretty much, okay, what do? You've hyped people up, given them plenty much to food, you've given them all sorts of stuff to drink, and now you're going to bring out possibly a naked woman. What could go wrong? And they had a record of that's exactly what they had done in the past. Right? She had a lot of reasons not to do this. Okay? So when we go through and we want to be specific about the modesty, you have to understand that the nature of all the different reasons she could have had, we can't specify particularly to know what her specific motivation was. She had several possible reasons not to participate in this. Okay? So you end up with the rejection. She just refused to come. Now you get the second part, though, if you look at verse 12. At this rejection, you get, therefore the king was furious and his anger burned within him. I want you to note, you've got a king who, you've got feasting, okay, going on. Now this is on a literary scale, but remember this, because having some form of feast is going to be a theme through this whole book, especially when it comes to making decisions. Wine at that feast is going to be part of that. Okay? So you have feast, wine, making decisions. And that is going to be carried through as thematically through what you see here. But what you want to see now, we're also now portraying and we're laying groundwork as exposition for the whole book, even though in this individual story, we're already in rising action. It's telling you something about the king. He's done all this work. What he's trying to do, and trying to kind of appeal to all the people, if he has to spend all this stuff just to get their attention in preparation to try to convince them to go to war, is he actually a strong king? Not as much as you would think, even though he was known historically as having actually quite, this reputation. Mainly because he was the height of the Persian Empire in some ways for what they were able to do. If you read Esther, you get the impression, preview of coming attractions, that King Xerxes was probably not the reason why that happened. That's also true for a lot of other things in history. Okay? So you end up with this. And that he is very temperamental. He gets angry, and how to make decisions. The idea of how he goes about making decisions here is actually the real point as you look forward to the book, because he's not good at making decisions. He's not a rational decision maker. That's our point that you're going to see play out through the book, okay? So now you look at the counsel that was given in verses 13 through 15, because he's going through and he's asking, okay, I'm just bringing in my people whose job, remember, is to make me happy. That's the problem when you're a king, right? Everyone's job when you bring them in is they depend upon liking what you have to say, not whether or not it's great advice. But Because notice he says, he doesn't ask if we should do anything. He says, what should we do to the queen? Something has to be done to the queen. I just have to decide what it should be. Or I don't have to decide. I need somebody else to decide, and then I will rubber stamp it. Okay? That's how it's playing out. So what are we going to do? He says, why? She did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs. That's verse 15. That's true. She didn't obey. And that's the big problem of what they're going to say is, what's going to happen if she doesn't obey him? Why should anybody? That's kind of the argument. So that's what you find in verses 16 through 18 as the concern is that she's going to essentially set precedents. Okay? They're concerned that this is going to get out and that particularly all the women y'all are going to cause problems, is what he's saying. You know, you're going to find out that she didn't do this. And so now I want you to think about what that means is, what the basis of the advice is not actually about the king and Ahasuerus. It's about everybody else. The actual argument has to do with, the worst part about this is what's going to happen to our wives. Right? That's the part of the argument. Yes. That's right. That's right. We got the women are out of control. Which, by the way, that is exactly what they're doing. But that's where the irony is. In this story, are the women out of control? Who is actually presented as being out of control in the story? The men. Okay? So I just want you to see how this is written to inform us and so we properly understand what's actually going on so we get the right message and the right point from it. Okay? So then you get the advice in verses 19 and 20. When you get this advice, it is that there should be a decree, okay? And notice that cannot be altered, will not be altered. Okay, that's important foreshadowing as well. That the nature of these decrees, you can't change them once they go out. But there's this decree, and the important thing for our benefit, exposition, is there's going to be an opening. We're going to get rid of her, and so that means there's going to be an opening for the job of queen. And somebody else to fill that. When the king's decree, which he will be proclaimed, is throughout all his empire, then wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. Now you're back to trying to solve a problem that doesn't even exist, right? that they're afraid of could exist. That's where the motivations are important for understanding this. Okay, so now let's look at verse 21, because here we find the climax. And the reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. Now notice how this is worded. Who liked, it was the king and the princes. That's a good thing to do. So because of that, not just because the king liked it, but the princes liked it too. Everyone agreed, that's right. Why? We're going to be affected. So we're going to follow this advice. So now the decision has been made of what we're going to do. Now notice this. You have an emotional decision that was plain to the crowd. And I want you to think about what actually happened. You have irony in this story of essentially the ruler being ruled. That is how Xerxes is presented in the opening chapter of Esther. Okay? That he's a high ruler that's not really in charge. Okay? It is still early on in his reign, relatively speaking, okay, 3 years. And I would say that clearly because he is having this whole thing is set up by wanting to prove he's a big man by accomplishing something that his father failed to do, right? You got that going on too, that there's some issues here. So you look at the following action, which is found in the first part of verse 22. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and to every people in their own language. Okay? And this is that every man, we're going to go ahead with this, that each man should be master in his own house and speak in the languages of own people, which is denouement. But let's notice the following action. Okay, when he does this first part. This is going to come up again as the process that's going to be repeated through the book. So, again, when we come to themes that are repeated in a book, you want to be able to go because they provide a structure so you can understand of how things are changing and shifting. This is the same, and so you're looking at what changed around that same thing. Here's the original thing, the model, what the decision was about and how it's handled. When we get to the next thing where all these things are happening the same, then it puts attention to how does this, what was decision was made here, and that's how you go through the book, and he produces then this structure to appreciate the shift of decision making as you go through the book. Okay? So in this, you end up with letters to the provinces theme. It's going through the whole empire, every language. That you're going to see that repeated. Okay, we will ultimately come back to this very same reading and wording. Okay? So we'll finish it off, that each man should be master in his own house and speak in the language of his own people. Denouement is about how you should feel from this. Okay, what does that mean? Men should feel powerful. Okay, that's the first thing. Men should be feared, and men should be heard. Now, just to appreciate this, what's the name of the book? Esther. That's right, Esther. You got to appreciate, though, what he has accomplished in a literary way in this first chapter of setting this whole thing up by principle. And that kind of writing with really great storytelling structurally is what you're going to see throughout. And we will pick up there in chapter 2 next week.